Hey there, how are you all doing? Today, I'm bringing you something quite chilling. 3 creepy grocery store horror stories that will make you think twice the next time you're pushing a cart down the aisles. From eerie whispers between the shelves to sinister figures that linger just out of sight, these tales blend the mundane with the mysterious in the most unsettling ways. Whether it's supernatural occurrences or the obsessive gaze of a stalker, these stories showcase how ordinary places can become the settings for truly spine-tingling narratives. So, grab your favorite snacks, turn down the lights, and let's dive into these eerie adventures that promise to keep you looking over your shoulder during your next grocery run.
Story 1. Shadows in the Aisles.
Tom awoke with a start, his heart racing and his brow drenched in sweat. It was just another ordinary day at the Grocerymart, but for some reason, it felt different. He threw off his covers and swung his legs out of bed, wincing as his aching muscles protested. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 8:15 a.m. He was running late. He leapt out of bed and hurriedly dressed in his uniform, his mind still reeling from the vivid nightmare that had plagued his sleep. In the dream, he'd been working in the produce section when everything around him had begun to move on its own. The fruits and vegetables had taken on a sinister, twisted form, their leaves and stems writhing like living things. And then, from the depths of the aisles, he'd heard whispers. Whispers that sounded like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Shaking off the memory, he made his way to the kitchen and grabbed a quick bite to eat. As he finished, he glanced out the window and noticed something odd. The sky was an ominous shade of purple-black, and the air felt heavy and oppressive. He chalked it up to his dream-addled state and hurried out the door, eager to get to work and put the nightmare behind him. Grocerymart was bustling as usual, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The customers seemed more agitated than usual, their movements jerky and their expressions worried. As he made his way to the produce section, he caught a glimpse of a customer arguing with a cashier, their voices rising in anger. "I swear, I put it in my cart," the customer insisted, her voice trembling with frustration. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's nothing in the system. You must have put it back before you got to the register," the cashier replied, her voice calm and soothing. Tom couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine as he continued on his way. He tried to brush it off as just another day at the office, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach refused to subside. As he began to stock the shelves, he noticed that the fruits and vegetables seemed to be moving on their own, sliding along the counters and tables. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was unnerving. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone else noticing, but the other employees appeared to be oblivious. Perhaps he was just imagining things, he thought. Maybe it was the stress of the job, or the fact that he hadn't been sleeping well lately. He forced himself to focus on his work, pushing the strange occurrences to the back of his mind. As the morning wore on, however, the incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing. A customer reported finding their cart tampered with, and several items vanished from their baskets while they were in the aisles. Tom's attempts to brush it off grew more and more futile, and by the time his break rolled around, he was a nervous wreck. He ducked into the staff room, closing the door behind him and leaning against it, trying to catch his breath. "Is it just me, or is something really weird going on today?" he asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at him since the beginning of his shift. The other employees exchanged glances, looking uncomfortable. "I dunno, man," one of them said, shrugging. "I've been feeling a little off myself, but I figured it was just one of those days." "Yeah, me too," another agreed. "Maybe it's just the weather." But Tom knew it wasn't. Something was definitely wrong, and it was only getting worse. His break over far too soon. He returned to the floor, his mind racing with possibilities. As he made his way through the aisles, he couldn't help but notice the way the shadows seemed to dance and shift, almost as if they were alive. Finally, near the end of his shift, Tom discovered a hidden room behind a false wall in the dairy aisle. Inside, he found a collection of twisted ritual objects and occult symbols. His blood ran cold as he realized the truth. Grocerymart wasn't just a supermarket anymore. It was a portal, a gateway to some dark and terrible place. And it was his job to stop it. With shaking hands, Tom called the police and told them everything. As the officers arrived and began to investigate, he couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of fear and determination. He'd been chosen for this task, somehow, and he was determined to see it through to the end. But the knowledge that what lay beyond the portal was something beyond his comprehension only added to his terror. As the day drew to a close, Tom stood outside the store, watching as the police cars and ambulances pulled away, their lights flashing in the gathering darkness. The portal would not be closed easily, and the fight against whatever horrors lurked on the other side would be long and difficult. But Tom knew one thing for certain. He would not rest until Grocerymart was saved.
Story 2. The Unseen Shadows.
Josh, a young man in his mid-20s, was just like any other day, enjoying his weekly shopping trip at his local grocery store. The store was bustling with people, the aisles filled with colorful displays, and the air filled with the sound of chatter and clanging carts. He was humming a tune under his breath as he made his way down the aisles, grabbing items off his list and tossing them into his cart. He'd come to this particular store so many times that he could almost navigate it with his eyes closed. As he rounded a corner, though, he caught a glimpse of someone out of the corner of his eye. It was a tall, lanky man with slicked-back black hair and piercing blue eyes. He was standing near the checkout lanes, his arms folded across his chest, and he seemed to be staring right at Josh. Josh shrugged it off, figuring he must have just been imagining things, and continued on with his shopping. Half an hour later, as he was waiting in line to pay for his groceries, a charity worker walked past, collecting donations. The tall man, who Josh now recognized as Andrew, leaned in close and whispered something to him. Startled, Josh glanced at him before quickly looking away, mumbling an apology and digging some change out of his pocket. He tossed it into the collection box and hurriedly stepped forward to pay for his groceries. As he left the store, Josh couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew's gaze was still on him. He climbed into his car and drove home, his mind racing with thoughts of the strange encounter. He tried to convince himself that Andrew was just some weirdo who got off on being creepy, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. Months passed, and Josh tried his best to forget about Andrew. He saw him a few more times at the store, but always managed to avoid him. That is, until one day when Josh was at the store, grabbing a few things for dinner, and Andrew approached him again. This time, Andrew didn't bother to hide his intentions. He walked up to Josh, flashed a toothy grin, and asked for his phone number. Josh felt a chill run down his spine, but managed to keep his cool, politely declining and excusing himself to continue his shopping. As he rounded another corner, Josh glanced over his shoulder and saw Andrew standing there, watching him with those unsettling blue eyes. A shiver ran down his spine, but he forced himself to keep going, trying to act as if nothing was wrong. But every time he turned around, Andrew seemed to be right there, just out of arm's reach. He began to feel trapped, like he couldn't escape the man's gaze. Finally, Josh could take it no longer. He made his way to the store manager's office and reported Andrew's behavior. The manager assured him that they would take care of it, and that Andrew would be banned from the store if necessary. But the next time Josh was there, Andrew was still lurking in the shadows, watching him. He was always careful to stay out of sight, but his presence was unmistakable. Josh felt like he was being stalked, and he was starting to panic. As the weeks went by, Josh's fear began to consume him. He started to avoid the store altogether, finding alternative places to shop. But it was no use. Andrew seemed to be everywhere he went. One day, as Josh was walking down the street, he caught a glimpse of Andrew's car pulling up beside him. His heart pounded in his chest as he ducked into a nearby alleyway, frantically looking around for somewhere to hide. But Andrew's car didn't follow. It just drove off. Josh waited a few minutes, then slowly emerged from the alleyway, trying to calm his racing heart. As he turned the corner, he came face to face with Andrew. The tall man was standing on the sidewalk, leaning against a mailbox, his arms crossed over his chest. He smiled when he saw Josh, and Josh couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. Andrew started walking toward him, and Josh panicked. darting back into the alleyway. But this time, Andrew followed him. "You can't hide from me," Andrew whispered, his voice eerily calm. "Not anymore." His words sent a shiver down Josh's spine. "You know what I want," he continued, "and you're going to give it to me." Terrified, Josh turned and ran. He sprinted down the alleyway, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Andrew's footsteps echoing behind him, growing louder with each passing second. Finally, he reached the end of the alley and burst out onto the busy street, ducking into a crowd of people. He looked over his shoulder, relieved to see that Andrew wasn't following him anymore. But he knew that it was only a matter of time before Andrew found him again. Andrew's obsession with Josh had become an all-consuming nightmare. He was no longer safe in his own city, let alone his own life. He had to do something. But what? He couldn't go to the police. Andrew had been nothing but polite and respectful whenever they'd crossed paths. He couldn't even go back to his friends and family. How could he explain what was happening to him? He felt like he was alone, trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake. Days turned into weeks, and Josh found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for Andrew's gaze to fall upon him once more. He began to wonder if he would ever be free from this terrible, relentless pursuit. But then, one day, as he was walking down the street, he noticed something different about Andrew. The man was no longer staring at him with those piercing blue eyes. Instead, he seemed to be looking right past him, as if Josh were invisible. Cautiously, Josh followed Andrew from a distance, watching as the man continued about his business. It was then that Josh realized that Andrew's obsession with him was over. He had no idea why it had started in the first place, or what had caused it to end, but he wasn't about to question it. Slowly, cautiously, Josh began to rebuild his life, trying to put the terrible ordeal behind him. But even though Andrew no longer haunted his every move, Josh could never truly forget what had happened. The memory of those piercing blue eyes would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the world, just out of sight. And while he tried his best to move on, he could never truly shake the feeling that Andrew was still out there, somewhere, watching him, waiting.
Story 3. The Unsettling Checkout Guy.
When I first started working at the supermarket, I was eager to meet new people and earn some extra money to put towards my college tuition. The store was always bustling with customers, and I found myself quickly falling into a routine. I worked the register, restocked shelves, and helped customers load their groceries into their cars. It was a simple job, but it felt good to be part of something bigger. One customer, an elderly man with patterned shorts and sandals, always seemed to stand out. His name was Mr. Jenkins, and he came in almost every day. Despite his friendly demeanor and kind words, there was something off about him. He always asked about my schedule and seemed overly interested in my whereabouts even when I wasn't working. At first, I chalked it up to him being lonely or just being an eccentric old man. But as time went on, his behavior began to make me feel increasingly uncomfortable. I tried to maintain a professional demeanor around him, but it was difficult not to feel a sense of dread whenever I saw him approach the register. One day, as I was restocking the shelves, he came up behind me and started a casual conversation about the weather. His breath was hot and foul against the back of my neck, and it took all of my self-control not to turn around and scream. I mentioned my unease to my supervisor, Linda, who was understanding but not overly concerned. She told me that she'd keep an eye on him and make sure he didn't cross any lines. Although I appreciated her support, I couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. It didn't help that Mr. Jenkins seemed to sense my discomfort, as he would often give me a knowing smirk whenever Linda was nearby. One afternoon, as I was clocking out for my break, Mr. Jenkins was waiting for me by my car. He asked me if I wanted to join him for a cup of coffee at the local diner, and despite my better judgment, I agreed. As we sat across from each other in the booth, he sipped his coffee and studied me intently. I tried to make conversation, but I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally broke the silence. "You know, you remind me of someone," he said, his voice soft and conspiratorial. "Someone who I used to know a long time ago." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, handing it to me. The image showed a young woman with long, dark hair and a mischievous grin. She looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place her. "Do you recognize her?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. I hesitated, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. "She was a friend of mine once," he continued, "but she betrayed me, just like you're going to betray me." My heart began to race as he leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You see, she worked at a supermarket too, just like you, and she made the same mistake you're making." I tried to maintain my composure, but I could feel the panic rising inside me. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I don't have anything of yours, and I don't want any trouble." He smiled sadly, shaking his head. "It's too late for that," he said, standing up and handing me back the photograph. "You're already in too deep." As I walked home, my mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Jenkins was somehow connected to the disappearance of the woman in the photo. I considered going to the police, but I was terrified of what he might do to me if I crossed him. For the next few days, I went about my job as normally as possible, trying not to let my fears show. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same again. The next time I saw Mr. Jenkins, he was waiting for me outside the store, leaning against my car. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, pointing a gnarled finger at me. "Now you've made me angry." Before I could react, he lunged forward, grabbing me by the arm and dragging me into the alley behind the store. My screams echoed off the concrete walls as he pinned me to the ground, his face twisted with rage. "You don't understand what you've done," he growled, his breath hot against my face. "You've made this personal." Terror gripped me as I struggled futilely against his strength. Just as he raised his hand to strike me, a police officer rounded the corner and shouted, "Freeze! Put your hands where I can see them." Relief washed over me as the officer approached, hand on his holster. "Officer," I managed to choke out, "I need your help." I pointed to Mr. Jenkins, who was still struggling against the officer's grip. "He's been stalking me, following me home. He's been harassing me." The officer looked from me to Mr. Jenkins, his expression unreadable. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice calm and controlled. Mr. Jenkins glared at me, hatred burning in his eyes. "She's lying," he spat. "She's just trying to get back at me for what I did." The officer frowned, studying the two of us for a moment before speaking again. "Well, miss," he said, turning back to me, "why don't you come with me and we'll sort this all out at the station?" I nodded, still trembling, and allowed the officer to lead me away from the alley. As we walked to the patrol car, I couldn't help but cast a nervous glance over my shoulder at Mr. Jenkins. He was being escorted to the back of the police cruiser as well, but his gaze never left me. I knew that this wasn't over yet, and that Mr. Jenkins would stop at nothing to make me pay. As it turned out, the officer didn't believe my story about Mr. Jenkins either. Perhaps it was my history of petty theft. Maybe it was just the way I was acting. Whatever the reason, he let Mr. Jenkins go without pressing charges. Instead, he warned me to stay away from him and to be careful about who I accused from now on. The next day, I didn't go to work. I was too afraid to face Mr. Jenkins again, and I didn't know what he might do if he saw me. Instead, I spent the day holed up in my apartment, the blinds drawn and the doors locked. I didn't answer the phone or the door, and I didn't even turn on the television. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or think straight. Late that night, there was a knock at my door. I froze, my heart racing, and then I heard Mr. Jenkins' voice calling my name. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted. "We have some unfinished business to attend to." Terror gripped me like an icy fist as I realized that there was nowhere I could go to escape him. Slowly, I moved towards the door and unlocked it, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. When I opened the door, Mr. Jenkins was standing there, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "I thought you'd be smart enough to hide," he said, taking a step forward. "But I found you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a long, slender object, revealing it to be a knife. "Now it's time for you to pay the price." I screamed and tried to slam the door shut, but it was too late. Mr. Jenkins pushed past me, forcing his way into my apartment. I backed away from him, terrified, as he advanced on me with the knife. He was going to kill me, just like he had killed the woman in the photo. I could see the madness in his eyes, and I knew there was no way I could stop him. Just as he was about to strike, there was a deafening crash from my living room window. Glass shattered everywhere, and a figure clad in black leapt through the opening, landing gracefully on the floor. It was the supermarket manager, Mr. Thomas. "Leave her alone, you bastard," he shouted, advancing on Mr. Jenkins with fists clenched. "She's done nothing to deserve this." Mr. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered the knife. "You don't know what she's done," he growled, taking a step back. "She betrayed me just like the others." The manager narrowed his eyes, not wavering. "I don't care what she's done," he said, his voice steady. "She's not worth getting killed over." For a moment, it seemed as though Mr. Jenkins might attack the manager anyway. But then he seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him. He turned and walked towards the door, muttering obscenities under his breath. As he left, the manager turned back to me, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, offering me his hand. I took it gratefully, allowing him to pull me to my feet. "I'm fine," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "I think I'm just going to go to the police now." Together, we made our way to the front door, and I watched as Mr. Jenkins disappeared into the night. Maybe, just maybe, I had finally managed to escape him for good. As it turned out, the police didn't believe my story about Mr. Jenkins either. They thought it was just a misunderstanding, and that I had made up the whole thing to get out of work. They didn't press charges against him, and he was allowed to continue his life as usual. I, on the other hand, was left to live with the fear and the guilt, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day when he would come back for me. For a long time, I was too afraid to work at the supermarket again, even though it was the only job I knew how to do. Eventually, I managed to find another job in a different city, and I started over under a new name. I never told anyone about Mr. Jenkins or what had happened to me, and I tried my best to put it all behind me. But even though I'd escaped his grasp, I could never truly forget him or the horrors he had put me through. And so, I continued to live my life, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day when he would find me again. Because deep down, I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter how much time passed, he would always be out there, somewhere. And one day, he would come for me. And when that day finally comes, I would be ready. I will have to be.
Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to listen to similar stories in future.